Welcome back to video number 2. Last time, I believe we left off talking about homeostasis. I hope you guys found the first video very, very informative. We're going to kind of keep on with that content. So if you bear with me, excuse me, let me share my screen and we'll kind of pick up where we left off. Let's see. Okay. You guys should be seeing my screen come up now. Again, hopefully everyone found that first video very informative. We're going to move on because we're going to skip past these because remember we talked about, the organizational level of the body going from the chemical structure to the cellular structure. Then we also went into and started talking about homeostasis. Remember, I mentioned that homeostasis is the body's happy place. That's where the body likes to be. So anytime things upset the body in its happy place, it does this thing called negative feedback, which brings it back to homeostasis. We also mentioned positive feedback. Positive feedback is not going to bring us back to homeostasis. It's actually going to kind of move us further away. We actually call that a necessary evil, or a vicious cycle, because it is something that has to occur. The examples of positive feedback within the body, we have childbirth, we have breastfeeding, and then there's also dealing with the blood pressure, right? So continuing on, we're going to talk about these homeostatic controls, because again, with homeostasis, the body has to be in a set range, meaning its happy place. So now when something goes outside of the happy place, we now know briefly what's going to happen as a result of the body going outside of its happy place. It's going to be disturbed, and then negative feedback, which we'll touch on again a little bit later, will bring us back to homeostasis. But when we're looking at the homeostatic controls, let's look at these things. We have some terms. We have what we call a receptor, we have what we call a control center, and we have what we call an effector. So now when we're looking at these, just think about what is actually going on or what is actually happening. So again, homeostasis is the body's happy place. So something has happened or occurred that moved the body away from its happy place. So that can be the stimulus. So for right now, you walk outside and it is blazing hot, right? You go outside, it's blazing hot, and you you immediately start sweating. I was going to say your body temperature changes, which is true, but you walk outside and some people immediately start sweating. That's the stimulus. That's the cause. Now, as a result of that, you have receptors on the body that will sense that something has changed. So these receptors in the body sense, oh, wow, there's a temperature change in the body, right? So now this receptor in the skin, right? These receptors are going to send a message to the control center. So again, your receptor is a sensor, so it senses that there's a change. It's going to respond to it by sending a message to the control center. Now, the control center is usually your brain or the endocrine system, depending on what issues are going on, what homeostatic values have changed. but it's usually going to be the brain or the endocrine system. You'll learn in Bio 169 that the endocrine system is also controlled from the brain, right? So your control center is going to receive that message from that receptor, usually in the brain. And now it's going to interpret that message like, oh, it's hot outside, using the previous example. Okay. So now it's hot. The body, the control center says, okay, let's try to figure out how to now bring this body temperature back down because it's too hot. And when we're talking about body temperature, we're talking about the internal temperature within the body, right? So the control center of the brain, or the brain rather, says, hey, let me figure out how to bring this temperature back down. Brings the temperature back down by sending a message. So the control center is going to interpret it. And now it's going to cause a response. It's going to send a message down to an effector. The effector is going to be various structures, but in this particular example, one of the effectors is going to be blood vessels. It's going to cause the blood vessels to dilate, which means to expand or open up. That's going to give off heat, right? As a result, we are also going to sweat. Sweating is a way of cooling our internal temperature down. So we got the receptor, the control center, and the effector. Those are the key terms that we need to be familiar with when we're talking about homeostasis and looking at those homeostatic controls or those homeostatic values, right? Now, shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk about anatomical terms. Now, if you are not told otherwise, then you are to automatically presume that your patient is in what we call anatomical position. Anatomical position is a universal position that is used in all healthcare. This is when the person is standing straight up, erect, right? Arms rather, are down by their side. Palms are facing forward or up. Feet and legs are shoulder length apart, pointing directly or pointing straight, right? And again, the person is standing straight up, eyes looking forward, things of that nature. That is anatomical position. As a result of this anatomical position, we're going to get some directional terms. The directional terms come from what we call these imaginary body planes that exist in the body. And we have three imaginary body planes. We have what we call a transverse or horizontal. We have what we call a sagittal or mid-sagittal. And then we have what we call a coronal or frontal plane, right? So I'm going to explain these right here briefly. The body planes, we have the sagittal, the frontal, the transverse. Now, the transverse or horizontal plane is going to separate the body into top and bottom halves. So you're just drawing a horizontal line, just like the line that you see there in this presentation, right? That's between body planes and section. That's a horizontal line, cuts you in top and bottom. That gives us these directional terms of superior, which means more towards the top, and inferior, which means more towards the bottom. All right. That's going to be our transverse. The sagittal or mid-sagittal is going to cut us and divide us into right and left halves. Now, if it's cut down the midline of the body, now the midline goes right here by down our nose, right? That's going to cut us into right and left paths that gives us the directional terms of distal. I'm sorry. Yes, distal, which means further up. Got. Let me back up because I didn't want to talk about distal just yet. It gives us directional terms medial, which means more towards the midline, and lateral, which means away from the midline, right? So medial, more towards the midline, lateral, away from the midline. That comes from the sagittal or mid-sagittal plane, right? The frontal or coronal plane kind of cuts us here and down by the side that separates the front half of the body from the back half. That gives us the directional terms anterior, which means towards the front or towards the belly, and posterior, which means towards the back, right? So now there's also some interchangeable terms with that one. We have ventral, which still means the same thing as anterior, and dorsal, which means the same thing as posterior, right? Now, what I had my blunder on a little bit earlier was distal and proximal. So I didn't want to talk about distal at that time frame, but you know, your brain is moving and sometimes words just come out sometimes before your brain catches up with it, right? Um, distal. Remember, proximal and distal have to deal with a point of attachment. The point of attachment is going to be our trunk. The trunk is this area right here in the body. And if I were to stand up, this is all our trunk, right? So now, when we talk about proximal and distal, has to deal with the point of attachment, particularly the trunk. Distal, think distance, means furthest away from the point of attachment, right? Proximal, proximity, think about that, means closer to the point of attachment. So those two terms did not come from um, the body planes that we just mentioned. However, they are very important because they can also describe locations in the body. So because of those body planes, we get those directional terms. Those directional terms now are used to identify and locate things within the body. What we mean by that is it gives direction. You're gonna say, my eyes, for example, are superior to my mouth, right? So those are ways to describe structures and their locations within the body. So it is very important that we understand those body planes and understand the anatomical directional terms. Again, you are to automatically presume that your patient is in anatomical position unless otherwise stated by someone else. Um, I lost my train of thought there, but um, stay tuned for part number 3, where we go into the different sections of the body, the quadrants and the regions.